So, shalom to all. This is Rabbi Sachs of the Chai Center, and welcome to the Chai Academy. Chai Academy is a selection of courses, classes, topics of Jewish interest, and we have been discussing for the past couple of weeks the history of modern day Israel. And we've discussed, in fact, so much, but each class is a self-contained one, and you should be able to follow with ease any class that you sign on to. So today's topic is essentially the Yom Kippur War. So we've discussed the War of Independence. We've discussed the 1967, the Six-Day War, and today we will talk about the Yom Kippur War. One of the it was basically a war of calamity for Israel and for the Jewish people, as we will explain. However, before we discuss the Yom Kippur War, I think we have to talk about an icon of Israel, and I'm talking about Golda Meir. She was affectionately known as Golda. She was really Golda Meyerson, but when everybody shortened their names, and he Hebraicized their names, so Golda changed it from Meyerson to Meir. Golda was, of course, a woman, and she was the first woman prime minister of Israel. She was the fourth prime minister of Israel. And what stuck out about Golda Meir is that she had a tremendous dosage of common sense. She was, throughout her illustrious history as a politician in Israel, she was an incredible commonsensical individual. Just to give you an idea, and remember this was in the 60s, right? And so 60s, 70s. Way ahead of her time. So it was the early years of the state, and it could possibly have been in the 50s or 60s. I mean, she emigrated to Israel, as we'll talk, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But so there was a lot of rapes happening, unfortunately, in Israel, and the cabinet met. She was part of the cabinet, and somebody said, foolishly, that maybe we women should not walk out at night, and we should pass some type of code that it's unsafe for women to walk out at night. Golda Meir, right? Her feathers were ruffled and her dander was up, and she rightly said, "Who's doing the raping? I think we should come out with a code, a law that men shouldn't be allowed to walk out at night." So, and she was feisty. I mean, she was in a man's world back then, and she was just incredible. So she was born in Kiev, in which is now Ukraine, and she basically, her parents emigrated to Milwaukee, where she was a teacher, she was a librarian, etc. And then later on, once she got married, it was a condition of marriage, is that she moved to what was called Palestine. And she always reflects that her earliest memory, her first memory that she could recall, was her father boarding up his home because of pogroms. Can you imagine? So what's your first memory, right? I have vague memories of being in a pre-K classroom. But can you imagine your first memory is that your father is boarding up the doors and the windows because it was about to be a pogrom? So her parents moved from Kiev, moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she became an adult there, and she was a teacher, she was a librarian, and eventually she moved to Israel, to what was then Palestine. So she has a famous story with her, by the way, is that Pope Paul VI one time criticized Israel. In private audience, he says, you Israelis, and you're too you're too aggressive. You are too, it's. I don't like. So, so it's interesting. What she responded to him was, my earliest memories in Kiev was a pogrom. And he says, and many of people my age, that's their earliest memories. So we were a merciful people. We had no homeland, and we were weak, and we were killed. Not going to happen anymore. That was her response to Pope Paul. So, as I said, in the early 20s, she moved to Palestine and she joined a kibbutz in the Jezreel Valley, and she was tapped as the only, as the only female to be in the cabinet. Ben Gurion once said that because she was so feisty and because she was so outspoken, Ben Gurion says, Golda Meir is the only male in my cabinet. Right? In 1948, she was dispatched by Ben Gurion on a dangerous mission. She was dispatched to secretly have a meeting with the Hussein in Jordan, asking him not to get involved in the war. So she went, right, a woman alone. She went to hostile territory, and she was not successful. But just that gives you just an idea how much confidence Ben Gurion had in her, that he sent her to Jordan. After 1948, she was appointed to the Israeli ambassador after the War of Independence, and Israel declared itself as a state. She was sent to be the ambassador to the Soviet Union. And there's a very famous picture of her. It was called Rosh Hashanah in Moscow. And when she came to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah in Moscow, in the big shul in Moscow, I think Rabbi Levin was at that point the chief rabbi, and over 50,000 Jews came out. 50,000 Jews came out to protest the Soviet rule and the limits, and 50,000 Jews. Now, the KGB, they were taking pictures of the crowds, and many people who attended that rally were actually sent for long stints in Siberia. And eventually she became Israel's foreign minister, and she was responsible mainly to forge relationships with the newly developed African countries. Now, in 1969, when the former Prime Minister Levi Eshkol died, she ascended to become the Prime Minister. Now, she was from the Labour Party, and she was what you call a lefty. She was, a secular Zionist, etc. But she was no dove. She was a hawk. She did not want a Palestinian state. She did not want a Palestinian people. What she did want was peace. And she tried her hardest to become peace, right? And when they asked her once about peace, right, they says, "Is peace attainable?" So in her Milwaukee accent, she says, "Absolutely, peace is attainable. Absolutely." She goes, "Let me tell you, I've given instructions. I've given instructions that every time an Israeli soldier is killed, I want to be told. Every time. Even if it's in the middle of the night." And he goes, when the Egyptian president Nasser, when he gives the same instructions to his people, every time an Egyptian soldier is killed, then there'll be peace. That was her comment. She was tormented in her final years as the prime minister because of the Yom Kippur War, which we'll now discuss. It's interesting. She knew that there was going to be a war, and she knew it. But the generals and the military advisors and the General Dayan himself said that, it's not so simple. And because of the mistake of the generals, 2,700 Jews, Israeli soldiers, were killed in action. So can you imagine? She was told 2,700 times that this so-and-so was killed, so-and-so was killed. So now let's talk about the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, of course, began on Yom Kippur. It was October 6th, if I recall, October 6th, 1973, where and it was once again it was a calamity. Egypt and Syria both attacked Israel. Egypt, who was at the south, attacked the Sinai Desert. Remember, Israel had gotten the Sinai Desert in the Six-Day War, so they attacked the Sinai Desert, and Syria attacked the Golan, and it was huge. We're talking about huge armies, huge, vast armies, and so whatever gains Israel had made in the Six-Day War, they had actually they had lost within a couple days in this war, in this Yom Kippur War, and they attacked on Yom Kippur. As I said, it was a surprise to many, albeit not really a surprise, and since they attacked because they knew it was the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, and most Israeli soldiers were on leave. So just to give you an idea, when Egypt attacked, they crossed the Suez, and they blocked the Suez and crossed the Suez Canal. They had 70,000 soldiers, and the amount of soldiers that Israel had was 500. 70,000 Egyptian soldiers versus 500. Within a week, Israel had gained back the territory on both ends. So talk about a miracle. I mean, this was, yes, they were brilliant people and brilliant generals, but this is clearly to me an open miracle. But now it's interesting. So while it was the sickest thing for the Arabs to do to attack the Jews on Yom Kippur, it's almost like us attacking Muslim on the last day of Ramadan. So they attacked on the holiest day of the year. But it was terrible, and the optics were bad, and they were caught unawares, and etc. But because it was Yom Kippur, and you have to listen to this because this is fascinating. Because it was Yom Kippur, it was very easy for them to make an announcement. We need as many soldiers as we can, and so every shul was packed. Every synagogue was packed with Israeli soldiers, and the word spread. Come on, get out there. They didn't have to go door to door. Come on, we need. They didn't have to institute a draft. They just announced it. Every available soldier back. Right. So there was a good side to them attacking because they were all in one place. They were all in synagogue. They didn't have to go from door to door, and that was an incredible thing. So, and it was actually considered a mistake. The Arabs, the Muslims, Egypt and Syria, thought that they were doing a brilliant thing, but actually was a mistake, and it backfired because they gained their army back so quickly. And once again, within a week, Israel had beaten them back and regained control of the Sinai Desert, and also regained control of the Golan Heights. Right? Now, General Dayan, Moshe Dayan, right? He figured a couple of things. He says, first of all, Egypt would never attack until they have a full air force. And if you remember the Six-Day War, Israel just bombed the daylights out of them. So he says, you know what? They may be eager to attack, but they'll never attack because they don't have a full air force. And also, he said Egypt would never attack without Syria independently. He was right on the second one. He was right. Egypt and Syria joined together and attacked north, south, right? Attack. Jordan stayed out of it. But so from the east, Jordan stayed out. But north and south, it was a brutal attack. And Egypt and Syria did attack. And it was a so General Dayan actually, General Dayan actually really, he was, even though he wasn't held accountable later because it was, military theories, and he was a strategist at that point, it was still a mistake, a faux pas, whatever you wish. Now, Golda Meir was also um, she was so when it was imminent and she was told by her generals. So even though she felt from what she saw, and once again, this was a lady with tremendous common sense, she did not preempt and she did not attack first. And the reason she gave is that they were so beholden to the United States, she didn't want to tick off President Nixon. She relied on him heavily, and they had a decent relationship, but she didn't want to tick him off. She did not want to get Richard Nixon upset, and she knew that if she did a preemptive strike, Richard Nixon would I mean, the United States basically, they financially backed Israel. Jews don't like to hear that, by the way. Maybe it's because Nixon was a Republican, etc. But Golda Meir, in her own autobiography, she credits Richard Nixon for really stepping up and helping Israel. About a month after, there was the Agranat Commission to see what happened. 2,700 soldiers killed. Right, 2,700 soldiers killed. It was more than 6-day war, more than the War of Independence. Like, what happened here? So there was a commission set up, a government commission, to see what happened. So it's interesting. Moshe Dayan was exonerated, and Golda Meir was exonerated. And in the commission, if you look at it, if you can Google it, it says that she acted with alacrity. She acted with common sense. She acted in the best way possible. And she's not to be blamed, but because of after the war ended, there was she felt terrible, and also there was so much fighting going on in her cabinet and finger pointing. Who's to blame? Who's to blame? How are you? And so she actually resigned. She actually resigned as a prime minister. And she still remained, involved, but she no longer wanted to be the prime minister, and Yitzhak Rabin took over. Now, what's interesting about it, if anybody has any questions, I don't know if anybody is. No, I don't think so. It's interesting. The Yom Kippur War was actually it was. Once the war was over, different things changed because of the Yom Kippur War. So first of all, Sadat, right? Sadat of Egypt. So he said, you know what, 70,000 versus 500, and I still can't beat them, right? So he actually gave up. He actually gave up fighting. He says, I'll never be able to beat Israel. I just won't. Now, he also said, and you know what? When this in the 6-day war, when Egypt took the Sinai from when Israel took the Sinai from Egypt, and the Arabs, they live on honor, like the Chinese. So the Arabs were humiliated between themselves, as far as how could you lose that war when you had you should have won that war. And so when they killed 2,700 Israeli soldiers, and Sadat felt, and he mentioned it, that he had at least restored some honor to Egypt by killing 2,700 Israelis. In other words, they didn't get off light. Israel didn't get off light. Israel got off with many, many casualties, and Sadat felt that was some honor restored. And because of the Yom Kippur War, when he realized that it's a fait accompli, that he'll never be able to beat Israel, the seeds of peace were planted in Sadat's brain. And it led to 4 years later, if you recall, to peace with Jimmy Carter, and it was Sadat and Begin, I think, right? So that was it was a few years later when Jimmy Carter was president, right? It also, the other thing the Yom Kippur War led to was that the infighting that went on for a couple of years led to the Labour Party losing for the first time in 1977. So 1977, Menachem Begin became the prime minister. And from 1948 to 1977, the Labour Party had been basically, had been the party. And because of the war and the long memories Israelis have, um, it led actually to Labour being ousted, and now the Menachem Begin becoming the prime minister. And when he became the prime minister, it was interesting. So he was basically on a worldwide terrorist alert, right? He was the terrorist that killed so many British. So I remember I lived in England at the time in 1979, I think it was, and was 78. Begin came to England, and he was accorded great honor as the prime minister, even though that he was, many years before he was wanted dead. They wanted him, wanted dead or alive. They wanted Begin, and here he came. He came to England, and he was given a honorific because he was the prime minister. To me, by the way, Begin was the greatest prime minister of Israel. He was the greatest, most honorable person of Israel. Anyway, in 1977, Begin Likud finally took control of the government, and once again, they relied heavily on the United States for money. The other thing that the Yom Kippur War did was it decimated the economy. In those couple of months that they were fighting, it basically cost Israel the GDP for an entire year. It was so expensive, and it was devastated. And without the United States, as Golda Meir writes, Israel would have had a very, very hard time. Now, Begin and Biden didn't get along. It's true, as somebody commented, that Begin yelled at Biden, says, "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not going to kowtow to you." It was a famous story. But after the Yom Kippur War, Israel, once again, they got back their land, the Sinai and the Golan, and due to immense Arab pressure, African nations broke off. Why the heck they got involved, who knows? But the African nations, they broke off relationships with Israel. Everything that Golda Meir built as a tenure as foreign minister became undone, and the Arabs forced a lot of pressure, and they forced it was an embargo. If you recall, for a long time you couldn't get Pepsi in Israel because the Arabs coerced Pepsi to say, if you sell it in Israel, you can't sell it in our lands. It was terrible. The Yom Kippur War, so those Arabs put a lot of pressure. They said, okay, they can't beat Israel from within. They're going to try and beat Israel from without. 2 years after the Yom Kippur War, the UN did the unthinkable, and we'll talk about it in another class. And it was because of the Yom Kippur War. The UN came out with another resolution that Zionism is racism. It was so hurtful and also pathetic that really it's unforgivable what the UN did. Just unforgivable. The Zionism is racism. Now the Arabs also pressured the world with this oil embargo, and if you remember the long lines, I have vague recollections of the long lines in 1976, I think it was, where there was just because the Arabs were applying pressure on the world. It was just a very hard time for Israel. But worst of all, Israel won the War of Independence in 1948. They won the war in 1967 in 6 days. In 1973, it shattered their confidence. Just shattered their confidence. Until then, Israel, from 1967 to 1973, it was Israel, 73, 74, thank you, Lenny. Israel was you know, they were on top of the world. They had gotten back this. The Arab world was afraid of them, and they basically, you could go to Ir David, you can go to Hebron, you can go, nobody would attack you, because, and then but after 73, the feelings were in Israel, my goodness, we're not indestructible, and the feelings were with the Arabs that they're not indestructible, and we can get them by different means, not necessarily by war. So hence terrorism, hence oil embargoes, Pepsi embargoes, product embargoes, and they placed a heavy amount of pressure. Unfortunately, Carter was no Nixon, and Carter, who is the founder of modern day terrorism, with Iran, but Carter sided with the Arabs. Many more countries, many more people to consider, and the oil embargo was shoved down his throat, and the Iranian Revolution, and he kowtowed. So unfortunately for Israel, that you had this 4 years of just Carter beating up Israel, and till today, Carter's in his 90s. And he still speaks derogatorily about Israel, and it's sad and it's unfortunate. And when Carter got brain cancer in his 90s, it was Israel that cured him. But sometimes you're just not going to get the credit that you deserve. So Yom Kippur War was changed things for many, and the Yom Kippur War was taught the Israelis that they always have to be on their guard, that there's nothing sacred with the Arabs, and even Yom Kippur, which was a low move, even Yom Kippur was not sacrosanct. So we have to talk. We'll talk about the UN resolution. Also, we have to discuss the different West Bank and we have to talk about the West Bank versus Judea Samaria versus other places, etc. But Carter, there's a movie documentary out there, and it's called, I believe it's called Relentless. And if you watch the movie, it kind of I'm not addressing any of these politics here with the presidents. I just know Biden was not Biden, Carter was just terrible for the, and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the two expressions, we have to discuss that. All right, and we'll talk about the UN resolution, Zionism is racism, which is most despicable. Will to be continued. Any questions, Rabbi at the Chai Center, any questions you can leave here. Don't forget to check out other classes that we have, thechaicenter.com/academy, or our YouTube channel. That's another way to view it, YouTube Chai Academy. God bless.